From the college by the lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We are very pleased to do several programs each year on books that we find interesting, and we invite the author to come to our program and discuss the contents of that publication. That is going to be the topic today, is review of a book. I'm very pleased to introduce to our audience this particular book. It's entitled The Nuremberg Funnel, Idaho-German Tales. The author of that book is George M. Klein, and he is our guest. And Mr. Klein, welcome to the program. We're pleased to have you here. I would like to not only introduce the book, but tell our audience a little bit about your background. Our guest is a native of Oakland, California. He came to the state of Idaho, where he received a degree from the University of Idaho in 1936. He then was employed as a farm management supervisor for the Department of Agriculture. He then was in the Army, the United States Army, for 6 years, and he served both in Europe and in the South Pacific, leaving the Army with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He did return to Idaho, and among the other jobs he had in 1948, he entered private business in Grangeville, a very beautiful city in our state, and later he became mayor of that city, serving from 1959 to 1966. In 1958, he was the president of the North Idaho Chamber of Commerce, and from 1971 to 1977, he was a field representative for the late United States Senator Frank Church. Our guest has been generous to come all the way from Boise, where he now lives, and to be with us, and the panel and I welcome you, Mr. Klein. And I would like to mention about your book that the profits from it are going to the Grangeville Bicentennial Museum, and I also would tell our viewers that it is open from June through September, and a little later on the program we'll give the telephone number for those who might want to call to visit that museum. It really preserves a lot of the history. Again, welcome to the program, and I would like to introduce our panel, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And as always, I shall ask Janelle Burke to commence today's questioning.
Well, welcome to our program. We're glad to have you here. You have titled your book, The Nuremberg Funnel, Idaho-German Tales. Can you tell us, what is the Nuremberg Funnel? What does it mean?
The Nuremberg Funnel was, the idea came originally from an old German postcard. The postcard was over 100 years old because the Germans had developed the process of coloring postcards before we ever had them in this country. And this postcard depletes two old professors from Nuremberg College who are putting the knowledge into the head of a student who isn't very bright, who sits there with his slate which says 5 and 2 equals 4, and they're pouring knowledge into his head. And that is a part of the story in my book about that particular photo and where it was placed, and a professor in German, a doctor, a German professor at the University of Idaho, who inspired a student and who had this picture on her wall in the 1936s. And not only does it relate to that particular illustration on the Nuremberg Funnel, but later in the book it refers to the hero of the book. You can say that he might be the hero, who is sent to Nuremberg during the trials and was an attorney and represented the people on the trial to try the German prisoners at that time who had committed atrocities against the human nature and human beings. So he had quite a tie-in with Nuremberg, not only when he first saw this picture on the wall of his instructor, and then later in his life he went to Nuremberg on the trials. So there is a little bit of both in the book, and this particular character follows all the way through and is tied in with the University of Idaho and the Idaho education system and the attorneys in Idaho. So I told a good friend of mine that it is a composite, this character is a composite of all the attorneys I ever knew, good or bad.
Steve Sheen.
Mr. Klein, what was your motivation for writing the book? What moved you to do it?
Well, I'd like to say I was moved right off the bat to donate the proceeds, do something for the museum. But actually the idea came from the fact that my children wanted some background on our family. We had a one particular treasure that was an old cuckoo clock that was saved from the fire and earthquake in San Francisco, where my folks owned years ago, and they saved from the fire. And they said, "Dad, tell us the story of that cuckoo clock." So I started telling that story, and I got so much encouragement that I thought, well, maybe I'm a writer. Now, I just said maybe, I'm not sure. I'm still not sure. But anyway, that's the way I started. And then I also, as I was writing this, I said, you know, there's so many things that I'd like to ask my folks, my grandparents and my father, about the old country and about what their experiences were. And I said, I just waited too late for a lot of things. There's too many gaps. And I know a lot of other people feel the same. When you're a child, you're not really interested, and as you grow older you say, well, they'll be around for a while, and finally they're gone, and nobody tells the tale. So I said, well, I'm going to tell the tale in stories of history. History of Idaho, history of San Francisco, history of the western states, and do it with stories. And so I got a lot of encouragement. I went to the Writers and Readers Conference at McCall, Idaho, and they asked me to read a story, and they gave me a great amount of attention and some applause when I finished, and that further encouraged me. You know, I got to thinking, well, maybe I can write. So I think that's one of the things about people that want to write, that they need encouragement. You know, you get so self-conscious sometimes about projecting what you know that you kind of feel that you can't do it.
Well, let's follow that up just a minute, if we may, because one of the other questions I was going to ask you was how long did it take for you to finish this book? Was it more difficult than you thought it would be when you started out?
That's true. It was much more difficult. You must have been writing yourself, because you know that.
Yeah.
You know that. At 7 years, over a period of 7 years, I wrote these stories. I rejected them. I was absolutely sick of some of them, and some of them I never let to see the light of day. But over a period of time, I just kept writing, and then I would reread them. And the disappointing thing about it was that sometimes when you wrote something, you think it was so great. Then you'd read it back in a day or two, and you'd say, how in the world did I ever write this? You know? And maybe somebody else might think it's good, but you're really the best connoisseur of your own work if you just read it and keep reading it. And there's a debate about whether you should write, if you're going to write, whether you should read other stories while you're writing, because you say, well, it might affect you. Well, I was reading Stegner, you know, the Angle of Repose, and I said, if I could just write like this man does, He has 3 stories going on at the same time about the West. Well, I could never aspire to that, but anyway, it did kind of keep me going, because it made me feel that there's some projection of yourself into a story, that when people read it after you, they do find your personality in it, and certainly in Stegner's stories you find his personality in those.
We want to get into some of the content of the book, and I didn't tell the viewers at the beginning that there are 14 stories in this book, and I want to follow up on that. First of all, are all the stories true, or are some of them fiction, or is there a mixture of the two?
Well, I've tried to be honest and say which stories are true and which stories aren't. But along the way, sometimes fantasy gets mixed up with the truth. So I took an author's license in some instances to kind of embellish the stories, but essentially they're true, and particularly the stories of my history, because I didn't want to modify those in any way, so I kept those much the same. But the story about the lawyer who was a graduate from the university, and the name of the story gives it away. It's The Squeak from the Golden Gate. Now, you know the reception that some people give to Californians. And it was just as true when this character, who I'm not naming, came from the Bay Area to the University of Idaho, who thought he was coming to save the people of Moscow from being ignorant about the great value of California. And they did a good job on him, and they took it out of him in 4 years and 3 semesters.
Well, I think you might have made a suggestion who that might be. If you sometimes this kind of question is not fair, because it's like asking someone among their children which one was the favorite. Now, I certainly wouldn't ask that question, but of your stories here, do you have a favorite? And if so, would you give us the story itself?
Yeah, I have a favorite. I have 2 favorites. I just can't say without, because I have to go from the sublime to the ridiculous or something like that. One story is the story of the jailbird dog, which essentially is a true story about, every small town and most large ones have trouble with dogs. Everybody who has a dog thinks the dog is just perfect, and then the guy next door thinks that dog is a nuisance. Well, I started a story about the dog and the dog catcher, and how the dog evaded the dog catcher and finally caught him, put him in the pound, and the owner came and sprung the dog from the pound by cutting the chain link fence. And it disturbed the whole city, the whole town. The town was 3,600, which was equivalent to its population. Elevation was 3,600. Anyway, the mayor and the city council had a big meeting about this dog. And they decided that as long as the owner was going to cut the fence and let the dog loose, that the only thing they could do was put the dog in the jail, in the city jail, which they did. And they put the dog in the city jail, and they precipitated a lawsuit by the owner, who went to an attorney and had a great complaint drawn up to sue the city for $5,000 for taking that dog and putting it in jail and keeping it from the owner. Well, what happened was that the dog was in the jail, and he was having a good time in the jail, but the owners were fighting about it, and finally they compromised and they let the dog out and released the suit. And one of the attorneys on this was Ray McNichols, who used to be the U.S. attorney. He was down at Orfino, and he was the attorney for the defendant, for the plaintiff who brought the suit against the city. So anyway, finally they let the dog home, and he went home, but he'd keep escaping anyway from his owner, and he's run right back to City Hall. He wanted to get in his cell in the jail. So finally the owner says, I'm through with this dog, you keep him. So the city had another meeting, the council, and they decided they'd keep the dog, and they made him the official city dog. And so he lived in the jail. Well, the jail was only used to throw drunks in and the border days and rodeo celebrations. So he had plenty of room down there, and he just loved it. And he ate scraps from the Candy Kitchen Cafe and went out to the city dump and chased the rats and had a great time. And so that was, they bought a license for him, and he just got to be a real well-behaved dog as he got older, because he just mellowed out and lived there in the city hall.
A little bit like people sometimes mellow out as they
Yeah,
grow older.
right.
Janelle Burke.
Well, you mentioned that you had a second story, and the first one was so good we'll have to ask you to tell a second story. But first, tell me, what kind of dog was he?
He was a Shar-Pei and Labrador combination.
That must have been an interesting dog.
He was an interesting dog. If you like dogs, you would love Buck.
Well, can you tell us a second story? You said you had a second story that was a favorite as well.
Well, my second story, I really like it, but it's a little sadder story, because it's a story of, I was in the Army, and I fought in the Big Red Division and during the Bulge. And, you know, Aachen, we had a siege on Aachen. And Aachen is just a few miles from Durham, where my father was born. But when I was in the Army, I wasn't thinking about any of my relatives or who lived there. I was a gung-ho GI, I guess, like we all were in that war, as against some others. We knew it was a war that was necessary, and we had to stop those Germans. And I really didn't think of myself much as a German, in fact. But anyway, I was in the infantry, and we smashed everything within sight. The only thing that really saved was a cathedral in Cologne. If you've been to Cologne, the cathedral there was sandbagged it all the way up, and it was off limits to artillery or air force. And so I never wanted to go back to Germany, because I always thought about it the same way as I could remember it, as a mess, just nothing but debris and disaster. But my son went on a singing tour from Missoula, Montana to Austria and through Germany, and he asked me to go with him. So I decided to go. This is 1990. So the story is I went to Durham, because I said, well, let's go to Durham and see if we see any traces of our relatives. So I went to Durham, and they found that the graveyard, that all the records had gone, the church had been blown up and so forth, and they had no records. And the graveyard had been blown to smithereens. The stones from the graves had been used to make a foundation for buildings around, because they had to rebuild Germany. And all they had left, they'd taken a big tomb and put all the bones into this big tomb. And I tell about standing there and how, without ever knowing these people, just their relatives that I was related to, how it grabbed me. The destruction of those graves, and all my ancestors were blown to smithereens in this graveyard, and that there was no record of anyone, and they were just all thrown into a big trough, like with a concrete trough. And it affected me, and I thought, you know, I understand now why people want the remains of their relatives to be brought home or to be respectfully handled in a grave in Vietnam or Korea or wherever it was, Okinawa. And in Grangeville, we'd moved a cemetery, make room for a park, and we had a lot of protests from that. And down along the rivers where the Indian artifacts are, the Indians were really concerned. And I said, this must be something that's inborn in us about our ancestors' relics and bones. And it really affected me to a point where I really got emotional about it. And my son said, Dad, you're taking this awful hard, you know. And it just came over me, and it was one thing that all the feelings that I had about being German and being in the American Army and being the infantry and trying to annihilate Germans all came up on me at once. And I said, these people who are so closely related to me, I never knew. How do I feel so emotional about this? And that's my story.
Steve?
Mr. Klein, how did writing that book change your opinion about the impact of people of German heritage on Idaho? Or did it?
Well, I don't think so, because I'm thinking that the Germans, people of strictly German ancestry, are kind of a thing of the past. I was talking to my wife the other day about our great-grandkids. They've got so many different nationalities in them, they cannot be described as German. Nor can the Germans in Germany really be described as German, because when I went there and studied their history a little, why, the Turks have overrun Germany several times, all kinds of nationalities, even the Swedes came down and conquered Germany. So whatever Hitler said about being a true German with the blonde hair and the blue eyes must have come from the Swedes who came from the north. And I can't, I can't really go so heavy on nationality as I used to, although I still say that in Minnesota we have a lot of Swedes and a lot of Germans. And you can see what the reputation is of the state of Minnesota, so you can see that probably there is something to their heritage.
You said that you had to struggle to select just 14 stories for this book. Does that leave you with a desire to write a second book?
Well, not really, because I never appreciated how much work it was to write a book. You know, I don't, maybe some people can sit down and just write and as it comes out of their brain or wherever they get it. But to me, it's hard work. And, I'm getting 85 years old, and I don't know that I'd be a Grandma Moses of the literary world.
I had promised our viewers that we would talk a little bit about the fact that you were giving the profits from your book to the Grangeville Bicentennial Museum, and I saw some photographs of that museum, and there's a lot of things of the history preserved. And I did indicate earlier on the program that it's open from June to September, but I want to give a telephone number for those persons that might be traveling across Idaho or down the Panhandle or up the Panhandle, and I will do that at this time, and our staff will put the number on the screen. It's area code 208-983-2104. It's my understanding that it's open on Wednesdays and Fridays, but if they call that number, as they're going to travel through, the staff would come and open up the museum and they could see it, and I know your profits will help them as they try to preserve history of this state and that region, and particularly as it relates to the German history. So I just want to do that. Now then, another question I have is, you were dealing with these particular stories, and it is with the German history. I was wondering, as you've looked at different cultures and different ethnic groups, are there some uniqueness to stories from one society to another one? Are there also similarities or threads that run through? If you were doing stories about Sweden or some other place.
Well, I'm sure there'd be a difference if you wrote about Sweden or another country, because a lot of the cultures are different, but in a lot of ways they're the same. Now, my sister-in-law, Elsie Nelson, who used to run the hotel in Moscow, wrote a book, and she wrote as a reflection of her trip to Sweden. She was born in the United States, but she went back to Sweden and looked up her ancestors and relatives, and she wrote a book which was entirely different than my book. Her book was more serious. I put what humor I could in it because I was brought up by a mother who saw humor in most everything, you know, even in my German father, who was pretty uptight most of the time. And so I think that I think in relation to that question, that people who read would probably find a common humanity in no matter what book you read. I've just got through reading the book on the English patient.
I'm going to have to interrupt, but
Yeah.
what we're saying is that all peoples have certain trials and have happened and stuff when that comes out. But I want to say to our viewers again who've joined the program in progress, we've been discussing the book entitled The Nuremberg Funnel, Idaho-German Tales, and again, we would recommend that this would be great enjoyment to read these 14 stories that you have put in the book. Our guest has been George Klein, who has a great history on this, and we thank you for coming all the way from Boise to Coeur d'Alene to do this interview, and your wife's with you and some other friends.
About Carm Spencer.
Yes, and I have to close here, but we hope that you have success with your book, and thank you for being with us.
I really thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest again has been George Klein. I invite you to be with us again next week at the same time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.